In the summer of 1980, IBM was the most powerful technology company in the world. Its revenue was in the billions. Its brand was synonymous with computing itself. When businesses needed a computer, they bought an IBM. That was simply how the industry worked. And in that summer, IBM decided to build a personal computer. Not because it believed in personal computers, IBM's own executives were skeptical that ordinary people would ever buy them in significant numbers. But Apple was growing, and Commodore was growing, and someone in Armonk decided IBM should have a presence in this emerging market just in case. To build the machine fast, IBM's engineers made two decisions that seemed perfectly reasonable in 1980 and turned out to be catastrophic by 1985. First, they built the IBM PC out of entirely off-the-shelf components. Every part came from suppliers anyone could buy from. Second, they outsourced the operating system to a small company in Seattle nobody had heard of, and they let that company retain the right to sell the same software to anyone else. Within 2 years, other companies figured out that if IBM had used off-the-shelf parts, you could build the same machine yourself, legally. Within 5 years, the clones were everywhere. IBM's share of the personal computer market it invented shrank from roughly 80% in 1982 and 1983 to 20% a decade later. The company IBM chose to write their operating system, the small firm in Seattle nobody had heard of, used the licensing rights IBM handed them to sell that same software to every single one of IBM's competitors. That company was Microsoft, and the decision IBM made in 1980 handed Microsoft the most valuable licensing position in the history of commercial software, while IBM got nothing it could hold on to. This is not the story of IBM's failure. It is the story of how IBM built its own replacement. Stay with me. Let me give you the numbers that frame everything that follows. IBM's share of the personal computer market it invented shrank from roughly 80% in 1982 and 1983 to 20% a decade later. By 1992, IBM reported a $5 billion loss, at the time a record annual loss for any United States corporation, despite still holding the lead in global PC market share. PCs had become a commodity, and IBM could not keep cutting prices fast enough to compete with the clones it had accidentally made possible. Known to few outside IBM and Microsoft at the time, Bill Gates had offered to sell IBM a portion of Microsoft in mid-1986. When it was already clear that Microsoft was going to become one of the most successful firms in the industry, IBM declined the offer. The purchase price would have been around $100 million. By 1993, that stake would have yielded a return of $3 billion, and in subsequent decades, orders of magnitude more. IBM passed on buying Microsoft for $100 million. Today, Microsoft's market capitalization is measured in trillions. In 2005, 24 years after creating the PC era, IBM completed the sale of its entire PC division to Lenovo of China for $1.75 billion. A business that had been losing money for years and whose cumulative losses in the 3.5 years before the sale exceeded $1 billion. The company that set the IBM PC standard, the company whose name the industry used for a decade, sold its PC business at a loss to a Chinese manufacturer for less than $2 billion. While the two companies IBM empowered in 1980, Microsoft and Intel, each accumulated market capitalizations in excess of $500 billion on the platform IBM created. How did this happen? One decision at a time. To understand how IBM made these mistakes, you first need to understand who IBM was in 1980 and how its culture worked. IBM was not a fast-moving company. It was a massive, deliberate, process-driven corporation built around selling mainframe computers and mini-computers to large enterprises on long sales cycles. Its engineers were excellent, its processes were exhaustive, its product cycles were measured in years, not months. When IBM's management decided to enter the personal computer market, they knew that their normal development process would take too long. The Apple II had been on the market since 1977. The market was moving. IBM needed a machine in roughly a year. That timeline was impossible under IBM's normal procedures. So IBM created a skunkworks project, a small, isolated team in Boca Raton, Florida, deliberately cut off from IBM's normal bureaucracy and given unusual latitude to move quickly. And to move quickly, they made the decision that would define everything that followed. Instead of designing proprietary components, as IBM always had, they would buy everything off the shelf. The IBM PC used industry-standard commercial parts throughout. That outsourcing attitude extended to software as well. Although IBM had significant internal software development resources, for the new PC they supported only operating systems they did not themselves write. This was not carelessness. It was a calculated bet on speed. IBM's engineers understood that using standard parts meant other companies could potentially copy the machine. But they believed IBM's brand would be enough to maintain dominance. Who would trust a no-name clone over IBM? They were wrong about that assumption, but the greater mistake was not the hardware decision, it was the software deal. When IBM approached Microsoft to supply an operating system, Microsoft did not have one. But Gates negotiated the contract anyway, then acquired an existing system from a small company called Seattle Computer Products, paying $75,000 total for software he would sell to the most powerful hardware company in the world. Gates included a clause in the agreement that allowed Microsoft to sell the operating system to other companies. Although IBM was under the impression it had significant control, Microsoft had retained the right to sell the operating system to other manufacturers. It was this clause that changed the course of technology history, allowing Microsoft to dominate the PC era. Within a year, Microsoft had licensed MS-DOS to 70 manufacturers. 70 manufacturers! In 1 year, every one of them a potential IBM competitor. IBM did not demand exclusivity. IBM's lawyers either did not understand the implications of that retained licensing right, or they understood and decided IBM's hardware lead would be sufficient protection. They were wrong on both counts, and the moment that became clear, changed everything. The turning point arrived in 1982, 14 months after the IBM PC launched. Its name was Compaq. Compaq was a small company founded by 3 former Texas Instruments executives. They had looked at the IBM PC and recognized its essential architecture, off-the-shelf Intel processor, off-the-shelf everything else, Microsoft operating system available to anyone willing to pay the licensing fee. The only piece IBM actually owned was the BIOS, the basic input-output system, the firmware that told the hardware how to talk to the software. Compaq spent $1 million to reverse engineer that BIOS using a technique specifically designed to be legally defensible. Engineers who had read IBM's documentation wrote specifications describing what the BIOS did. Then a second group of engineers, who had never seen IBM's code, wrote their own version from scratch based solely on those specifications. Because the programmers who wrote the Compaq code had never read IBM's reference manuals, nothing they wrote could have been copied from IBM's code, no matter how closely the two matched. IBM challenged clone makers in court. The legal strategy failed. Compaq's clean room reverse engineering withstood legal scrutiny, and IBM's broader attempts to stop the clone market through litigation came to nothing. By proving that a legally compatible clone business could scale and withstand legal challenges from IBM, Compaq paved the way for the flood of IBM-compatible clones that would begin in the mid-1980s. Compaq anticipated sales of $30 million in its first year. Instead, it made $111 million. Even though IBM had sold 750,000 machines in the same period, Compaq sold over 53,000 units. Once Compaq demonstrated that a legal clone was possible, a company called Phoenix Technologies did for BIOS firmware what Microsoft had done for the operating system. They developed a licensable, legally clean version that any manufacturer could buy. Suddenly, you did not even need to reverse engineer the BIOS yourself. You could buy one. By 1985, You could buy a PC clone with 256 kilobytes of RAM and dual floppy drives for $1,495, while the equivalent IBM machine cost $2,820. IBM had published its technical specifications openly, used parts anyone could buy, licensed its operating system to a company with the right to sell it to competitors, and then watched those competitors build a legal clone within 14 months. And every clone ran Microsoft's software, not IBM's, Microsoft's. IBM recognized the problem, but its response made things worse. In the mid-1980s, IBM attempted to reassert control over the PC market with a new product line called the PS2 and a new bus architecture called Microchannel. The idea was to build proprietary technology that the clones could not replicate without licensing from IBM, restoring IBM's ability to differentiate on hardware. It was a rational strategy in theory. IBM started releasing computers that used non-IBM standards only after the clone market had already consolidated. By the time the Pentium was on the market, most IBM computers were using open standards again, but by then, IBM was just another PC maker. Microsoft and Intel drove the industry. By 1995, you no longer heard the phrase IBM compatible. You heard Wintel for Windows and Intel. Wintel? The standard was no longer IBM's name, it was Microsoft's operating system and Intel's processor. IBM's brand had been replaced in the industry's shorthand by the names of its own suppliers. The escalation of IBM's decline accelerated through the late 1980s and into the 1990s. IBM had partnered with Microsoft to develop a new operating system called OS/2, intended to replace DOS and Windows. By 1987, IBM had over 1,000 programmers assigned to OS/2, costing an estimated $125 million a year. OS/2 came out in late 1987, priced at $340. By then, Windows had been on the market for 2 years and was proving hugely popular. While IBM was building OS/2 with Microsoft, Microsoft was also building Windows, its own successor to DOS. The partnership was real, but Microsoft's strategic interests diverged from IBM's at every turn. IBM wanted a proprietary operating system that would give it an advantage over the clones. Microsoft wanted an operating system that ran on every PC, IBM or otherwise. Microsoft's interest won. Windows spread everywhere. OS/2 failed. And IBM had spent hundreds of millions of dollars helping Microsoft understand what a next-generation graphical operating system needed to do. Gates offered to sell IBM a portion of Microsoft in mid-1986. IBM's executive declined, partly worried about antitrust concerns. By 1993, that $100 million stake would have been worth $3 billion. IBM turned down the chance to own a piece of the company that had displaced it. Twice. Once when they let Microsoft retain the licensing right in 1980, and again when they declined to buy Microsoft equity in 1986. The human cost of IBM's decline is measured not in abstract market share percentages, but in the people inside one of the most storied companies in American business history who watched it happen in real time. In 1992, IBM posted that $5 billion loss. The company that had defined corporate computing for decades, whose dress code and culture had become synonymous with American business professionalism, whose salespeople wore blue suits and drove the narrative of the entire technology industry, that company was now reporting the largest annual loss in United States corporate history. The decision to use off-the-shelf components had far-reaching effects on the business world. PCs would almost certainly have continued to spread without IBM, but the computers that would have spread in IBM's absence would have looked and worked differently. Instead of establishing IBM at the head of the computing pack, the PC eventually produced market capitalizations in excess of $500 billion for both Microsoft and Intel, while IBM sought buyers for its PC division. IBM's PC division, before the Lenovo sale, had been losing money every year since 2001. The PC unit lost $397 million in 2001, $171 million in 2002, $258 million in 2003, and $139 million in the first half of 2004 alone. IBM had been selling hardware that cost more to build and sell than it earned, competing in a commodity market against the very companies its own decisions had enabled. The deeper cost is the counterfactual. Had IBM demanded exclusive rights to the operating system in 1980, a demand they had every negotiating position to make? Since they were the largest technology company in the world, and Microsoft was a 5-year-old startup nobody had heard of, there would have been no compact clone, no Phoenix BIOS market, no Wintel standard. The architecture of the personal computer industry would have been entirely different. IBM would likely still have faced competition. Markets produce competition, but the competition would have had to build from scratch against a company that controlled both the hardware standard and the software. Instead, IBM gave both away, the hardware through open components, the software through a licensing clause their lawyers apparently did not fully interrogate, and spent the next 25 years paying for it. The honest accounting of IBM's failure requires separating hindsight from judgment, because the decisions that look catastrophic in retrospect were not obviously wrong at the time. The case for IBM 1980 decisions is real. IBM had never moved as fast as Project Chess required. Using off-the-shelf parts was the only way to ship the machine in a year. And in 1980, the idea that a startup with no manufacturing infrastructure could reverse engineer your hardware, produce millions of compatible machines, and undercut you on price within 2 years, that was not the obvious bet. IBM's brand carried enormous weight. The engineers who built the PC had good reasons for the choices they made, given the information they had. The case against those decisions is equally real, and it rests on one specific question: why did IBM not demand exclusivity on the operating system? IBM was the largest technology company in the world. Microsoft was a startup. IBM could have required that Microsoft not license the operating system to anyone else, and Microsoft would have had little leverage to refuse. It was the clause in the agreement that allowed Microsoft to sell the operating system to other companies that changed the course of technology history, opening the door for Microsoft to become the dominant technology company of the PC era. IBM apparently did not consider this concept, nor did it foresee that companies would successfully clone their hardware platform. Not foreseeing the clone market is understandable. Not closing the software licensing loophole is harder to explain. The most charitable reading is that IBM's legal team was focused on other risks. Antitrust exposure was a real concern for IBM in 1980, given its ongoing battles with regulators, and the operating system licensing was not the issue they were watching. The least charitable reading is that IBM's executives simply did not understand what they were giving away. What is not in dispute is the result. The company that created the IBM PC standard ended by selling its PC division at a loss to a Chinese manufacturer. The company IBM chose to write their software became, for a period, the most valuable company in the world. And the industry standard that carries IBM's initials has not carried IBM's profits for decades. A skunkworks team, deliberately isolated from IBM's normal processes, racing to build a personal computer in a year, using off-the-shelf parts, outsourcing the operating system to a company whose name most people in the industry had never heard. They shipped the machine on time. The IBM PC launched in August 1981 and was an immediate commercial success. IBM had done what it set out to do. And then, steadily, the consequences of how they had done it arrived. The clone makers, the compact lawsuit that IBM lost, the Phoenix BIOS that made cloning trivial, the Wintel standard that replaced IBM's name in the industry's vocabulary, the $5 billion loss in 1992, the sale to Lenovo in 2005. IBM still exists. It is a substantial company with significant businesses in cloud computing, consulting, and enterprise services. It pivoted away from hardware into higher margin work and that pivot has sustained it. But it exited the market it created on terms that required selling to a competitor after years of losses in a business its own decisions had made unwinnable. The next video in this series looks at the company on the other side of this story, Microsoft's ascent from the DOS deal through the Windows era, and the specific moments when the company that IBM accidentally built became powerful enough to challenge IBM's successor markets in enterprise software and cloud computing. Because the IBM story does not end in 1980, it is still playing out today. If this is the kind of history you came for, the decisions that seem routine at the time and reshape everything that follows, subscribing is how you follow the thread forward.